They said the king's coffin exploded. That was how the whispers began. Not in court, not in the records of Parliament, but in the kitchens and stables, where truth escaped beneath the weight of ceremony. The story crept along stone corridors, and echoed through drafty hallways, that when Henry VIII was finally laid to rest, his bloated, blackened corpse swelled like a poisoned hog. The lead lining of his coffin cracked, spilling a river of putrid liquid onto the floor of St. George's Chapel, and in the silence that followed, dogs from the nearby grounds broke through the chapel doors, and began to lick up the royal blood. Some claimed they saw it, others swore it was only a metaphor, but the records are curiously blank. Nothing noted in the royal journals, nothing logged by the priests, but they never denied it either. The death of a king is supposed to be sacred. Regal, a final breath beneath. Silk sheets, the scent of incense and candle wax clinging to the air. But Henry's last days were anything but. His flesh was devouring itself. His once mighty legs so strong they had carried him through countless tournaments were now ulcerated. Masses of decay. His mind, once sharp enough to dismantle an entire religion, was unraveling thread by thread, whispering of ghosts, curses, and things that moved in the corners of his chamber when no one else was there. Even the physicians, bribed into silence, confessed among themselves, this was not death by illness alone. This was something else, something darker. For weeks before the end, no one dared speak his name after sunset. Servants tiptoed past his chamber, too terrified to look through the door. They said he screamed in Latin, that he spoke to someone or something at the foot of his bed, that on cold nights, his voice would echo off the walls, begging for forgiveness or mercy. Don't know one answered. Outside, the kingdom was already preparing for his absence. Behind smiles and pageantry, the court had begun to rot, just as he had. Nobles plotted, ambassadors wrote cautious letters, and somewhere in the shadows, rumors began to grow roots, that Anne Boleyn's ghost had returned, that a curse laid by monks tortured and executed on Henry's orders had finally reached its target, that the soul of England's most feared monarch was being claimed, piece by piece, before the body was even cold, and yet, none of it appears in the official record. The chronicles of court historians present a cleaner tale. Henry died peacefully, they wrote, surrounded by his closest men, a candle in his hand, a prayer on his lips, but scrolled past the golden ink, and the margins tell a different story. In a letter burned before it reached the tower, one nobleman wrote, the smell within his chambers is not of this world, it sickens the soul. He does not sleep, he does not dream, he watches the walls, and he speaks to his wives. When they opened the doors after his death, the walls were scratched, not carved, not painted, scratched, long, deep gouges in the stone, as if someone, or something, had tried to claw its way out, or in. And when they lifted the shroud, some claimed the king's eyes were still open. This is not the story of a death. This is not the story of a man laid to rest. This is the story of a king hunted by his sins, a king who did not go quietly. This is the horrific final unraveling of Henry VIII. He had once been everything a king should be. When Henry ascended the throne in 1509, he was radiant, broad-shouldered, golden-haired, fluent in multiple languages, a scholar, an athlete, a man, said to be handpicked by God himself. To the people of England, he was not just a monarch, he was a promise. A Renaissance prince in a land desperate for glory. But promises decayed over the decades. The bright prince turned monstrous. The gilded court darkened. His gaze grew colder. His hands, once tender on a lute, signed execution orders with ruthless ease. 6 wives, 2 beheaded, a kingdom severed from Rome, thousands dead by his will, monks, nobles, even friends, all sacrificed for an idea of legacy that would forever elude him. At first, they blamed the injuries. A jousting accident in 1536 had left him crippled and writhing in pain. The wound in his leg never fully healed, becoming a swollen, ulcerous pit that oozed foul liquid and refused all treatment. It changed him. The pain fermented. The once vigorous king began to bloat, his body ballooning into something grotesque. They had to hoist him onto horseback with pulleys. He could no longer walk unaided. The mirrors were taken from his rooms, but the rot wasn't only in his body. Inside, something had started to fracture. Courtiers noted the shift in his eyes, that brightness dimmed, that suspicion crept into every corner of his gaze. He lashed out unpredictably. Advisors vanished. Rooms grew silent when he entered. Even his own children approached him with rehearsed caution. The man who once wrote poetry now spoke only of lineage and betrayal. He surrounded himself with symbols of authority, jewels, gold, weapons, as if they could armor him against the growing void. His rooms were filled with tapestries of Old Testament kings smiting their enemies. But behind the grandiosity, there was fear. In the quiet, the king muttered of divine judgment. He studied obscure scriptures, demanding answers about hell. He interrogated priests about purgatory and dreams. He had dismantled the monasteries, torn down the shrines, burned relics, sought to erase the Pope's influence from England forever. And now, in his final years, he feared what he had unleashed. Physicians noted his declining state, but none dared speak openly. The stench from his leg was unbearable. Some said it could be smelled from the corridor. The wound never closed. It festered, leaked. Insects were found in the bandages. On some days, his pain was so intense he struck walls until his knuckles bled. He demanded his doctors drain the leg with knives, then accused them of poisoning him when the pain returned. No medicine worked. By 1546, Henry was nearly unrecognizable. Over 400 pounds, swollen and sweating through his linens. He wore thick cloaks year-round. Despite the heat, his face was puffy and red, the eyes sunken into folds of skin. But worse than the physical decline was the silence. He had stopped speaking of the future, stopped drafting plans. Instead, he spent long hours alone, staring at a single oil painting, a portrait of Anne Boleyn, hidden in a drawer, supposedly burned years earlier. No one knew where he had retrieved it, but servants said they often heard him whispering in the dark, "Forgive me, forgive me, forgive me." When asked, the king denied any knowledge of the painting, but the servants kept finding it placed carefully on the table beside his bed. The truth is, by the end, Henry VIII was no longer ruling England. He was being ruled by something else, something behind his eyes, something seated deep in the marrow of his bones. Not grief, not madness. Something older, something watching. And as the king sat alone in his chamber, surrounded by gold, ghosts, and rot, it seemed he knew that, when death came, it would not come gently. The final months came on like a sickness in the bones, quiet at first, then relentless. By the autumn of 1546, Windsor Castle had begun to feel more like a mausoleum than a palace. The laughter of courtiers had vanished from the halls. The firelight seemed weaker. Even the servants moved differently, heads low, feet soft on the flagstones, glancing over their shoulders as if afraid something might be following. Because they weren't alone in that castle. Not truly. Something else had taken residence. In the upper chambers, something that no man dared name. And at its center, behind bolted doors, behind drawn velvet drapes that never opened to daylight, sat the king, swollen, silent, and increasingly, disturbed. He did not sleep, not truly. Nightmares came thick and fast, thick enough to rattle the servants awake from chambers far down the corridor. Moaning gave way to screaming, and then to silence. They found him once at dawn, sitting upright in bed, the sheets soaked through with sweat, eyes wide and bloodshot, whispering. She stood at the foot again. The candle would not go out. No one asked who she was, but everyone knew. Anne Boleyn, the queen he had once loved beyond reason, and then destroyed without hesitation. The mother of his only surviving daughter. The woman whose final prayer on the scaffold, some said, had not been for peace, but for vengeance. And she wasn't alone. Whispers spread of the other wives, too. Catherine Howard, her beauty butchered by the axe. Jane Seymour, dead from childbirth, her portrait now found face down every morning. Some believed he was being visited, one by one, by the women whose lives he had rewritten in blood. Whether phantoms of guilt or something far darker, they were there. The air in his chambers was said to be heavier now. Candle flames flickered without wind. The walls sweated moisture that stained tapestries and dripped into the hearth. And then came the marks. Scratches. Long, deliberate gashes carved into the wooden panels behind the royal bed. No tool in the castle matched them. Some were too deep, almost claw-like. Others formed crude-shaped circles within circles. Crude lettering, not in English or Latin. The priests were brought in under cover of night, but even they said little. They blessed the room and left hurriedly. One never returned. His name was struck from the chapel logs with no explanation. And always, there was the shadow. Several attendants reported seeing it, though none would put the memory to paper. A tall figure, motionless, at the far end of the king's chamber. Watching, not a trick of light, something darker than the candlelight. Darker than the shadows it stood within. The king never acknowledged it aloud, but once, in the stillness before dawn, a maid overheard him mutter, "Why are you always at the door? Just come in and finish it." It never did. As the year turned to winter, Henry's health plunged. He refused food, refused confession. He grew afraid of mirrors and ordered them all removed. He could not bear to look at himself anymore. What he saw, he said, was not just his face. His last surviving physician, Dr. Butts, kept a private journal. Its final entries remained sealed in the royal archives, marked with a crimson wax stamp, and the phrase "Nana Periator, sine causa," do not open without cause. But fragments leaked. Pages torn from early drafts suggest that the doctor had become convinced his patient was suffering from something more than illness. He referred to it not as a condition, but as a presence. The majesty grows colder by the day, not in flesh, but in soul. I fear, something ancient has taken root, and always, behind it all, the sense of waiting. The king seemed to know his end approached, but what haunted the castle in those final days wasn't death, it was the thing that would come before it. The deeper one digs into the final days of Henry VIII, the more the official records begin to blur. and the margins begin to speak. It begins with a letter dated January 24, 1547, just 2 days before the king's death. The handwriting is hurried, the ink smudged, addressed to Thomas Wriothesley, the Lord Chancellor. It reads only, "He speaks now to what is not there. His eyes remain fixed on the corner by the hearth. I dare not enter again." He asks for the executioner, not for punishment, but for penance. The letter was never received, or rather, it was intercepted and buried in a locked cabinet within the Tower of London. It surfaced only briefly, centuries later, in the personal collection of a disgraced antiquarian, and then vanished again. That is one of many such fragments. An unsigned page found among the Privy Council's logs now partially scorched mentions a vision of fire, witnessed during the night watch, and the scent of sulfur thick in His Majesty's chamber. The entry ends mid-sentence. The following day's record skips ahead, as if the gap had never occurred. That night, Windsor Castle's chapel bell rang out on its own. 3 times. No wind, no hand to pull the rope. Just a sound that echoed like an omen through the stones. Then there is the physician's journal, the one never meant for public eyes. Dr. Butts, once esteemed in Henry's court, wrote in his personal notes of an expression in His Grace's face I cannot explain, as though he were watching something move behind me. In one chilling line, he records, "At the stroke of 3, he sat upright and said clearly, 'I have made England a graveyard, and now it comes for me.'" But what was it? Some point to illness. The theories are endless. Advanced diabetes, renal failure, gangrene, syphilitic dementia. Each condition could explain parts of the decay, the madness, the hallucinations, but none account for the scratches on the wall. None explained why the servants refused to enter the room alone, why the windows frosted from the inside on spring mornings, why the king, in his final weeks, ordered all crucifixes removed, claiming they were mocking him. Then there is the incident with the portrait. One of the royal painters, Hans Eworth, was summoned late in 1546. The king had asked for a private commission, an image not meant for public viewing. When completed, the painting was so disturbing that the artist allegedly left court the next day without collecting payment. No copies remain, but a vague description survives in the notebook of a court scribe, a throne of bone, a crown melting into the face, and the eyes, hollow and yet watching. The painting disappeared after Henry's death. Some believe it was destroyed. Others say it was hidden, sealed within a stone wall beneath Windsor, locked behind mortars. And scripture, perhaps the most unsettling clue, though lies not in what was said, but in what was erased. A full page, exactly 1 day's record, was torn from the final volume of the King's Private Book of Hours, a devotional manuscript he had once annotated with his own hand. The missing page corresponds to January 27, the day he is said to have lost consciousness. Why tear a prayer from a dying man's book? What did it say? And who would want it gone? Some scholars suspect it was not torn by accident, that it was removed deliberately, perhaps not by the king, but by those who watched him die. A single monk, long forgotten, recorded in his marginalia, he passed in silence, but the room howled like wolves. There was no candle that stayed lit. What remains is a tapestry of fragments, half burned and censored, hidden and rewritten. Together, they suggest a truth too heavy for record books, that Henry VIII, once the most powerful man in England, did not die peacefully. He died staring at something no one else could see, and whatever it was already waiting. Asterisk, there is a moment in the unraveling of a man where the body is no longer the battleground. It is the soul. By the final weeks of January 1547, the King Henry Tudor, once radiant heir to Arthur's throne, had become a prisoner in his own skin. His chamber, once rich with tapestries and light, had grown dim and close. Windows shuttered. Fires left to burn low. The smell of rotting flesh had overpowered even the perfumes kept burning in bowls of silver and rosewater. The leg, his festering, lagused and bled, its bandages so frequently changed that linen ran short in the castle stores. Servants could no longer bear to be near him. He accused them of witchcraft, of whispering Latin spells in the corridors, but it was his voice that frightened them most at night. They heard it mumbling through the stone walls, sometimes in English, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in words no one could translate. Guttural sounds, low and rasping, as though spoken not from the mouth but from the pit of the body. On the worst nights, he sang, but the tunes were wrong. Twisted hymns that curdled the air and made the dogs howl outside the castle gates. The king's mind was slipping, yes, but not in the way of an ordinary man. No, there were moments of clarity, brief, piercing clarity, where Henry would weep, not out of pain, but out of fear. He once demanded all crucifixes removed, and the next day screamed for them back. He tore pages from scripture and swallowed them. He awoke once convinced his chamberlain was Thomas More, returned from the grave, and begged him to take me to the fire. Let it be done. No one corrected him. He spoke to his mother, to Catherine of Aragon, to his long-dead brother Arthur. He claimed he saw them, standing in corners, hovering in mirrors, standing in the hallway beyond the door. But more than any ghost, there was one name he repeated, over and over, a whisper at first, Then a growled Anne Boleyn. She came to him at night, he said, head in hand, blot down her gown, her eyes black as pitch, rimmed in sorrow. She stood at the foot of his bed, not angry, not vengeful, silent, watching. Servants refused to enter the room alone after dusk. One girl vanished for hours after being sent to bring clean linens. When she returned, she said only, there is someone else in there. Behind the curtain, he speaks to it like it's his queen. She was dismissed, silenced, sent home with her name does not appear again, but the silence of the palace speaks volumes. The corridors emptied. The music stopped. The court had retreated. No visitors. No final rites. Only the distant toll of bells and the rustle of black robes. Even his children Mary, Elizabeth, young Edward were kept away. He didn't ask for them. Instead, he spoke to the walls. The tapestries had begun to bleed, he claimed. Images of saints dripping red from their mouths. He ordered them burned. One night he screamed until his voice gave out, demanding the return of his old fool. Will Summers dead for years. He said the fool could chase away the shadows. That the laughter could drown them out. There was no laughter left in Windsor. The king had been a god once, a titan upon whose word men rose or fell, upon whose bed England's future was meant to be sung. But now, there was nothing divine about him, just a body, seeping and stinking. A voice, cracked with regret. A soul unraveling under the weight of its own history. And behind his eyes, something had taken root. It was not madness, it was memory, hunger, the slow realization that judgment had not forgotten him, and it had found the way in asterisk. When a man like Henry VIII dies, explanations follow like vultures. Some came cloaked in science. Scholars, centuries later, pored over his symptoms, diagnosing him from the grave. They pointed to renal failure, brought on by obesity and chronic infection. His festering leg and open wound for over a decade could have poisoned his bloodstream. Others pointed to type 2 diabetes, or Cushing's syndrome, conditions that would explain his paranoia, mood swings, and immense weight. Then there's the old rumor of syphilis, untreated and rampant, rotting the mind and body in tandem. But no autopsy was ever performed. No physician dared cut open a king. And so, these theories remained speculative, sterile, insufficient, because none of them explained the shadow, none explained the screams heard in the stone halls, the claw marks on the wall, the sudden chill in the air, despite roaring fires. None of them explained why the king refused holy rites, or why every crucifix was removed, only to be demanded again, shaking and breathless. Some historians ventured further. A few brave or foolish souls suggest Henry's mind was not ill, but haunted, cursed, perhaps, by the same church he had shattered. In the wake of the dissolution of the monasteries, entire abbeys were burned, their relics defiled. In Glastonbury, the abbot was dragged up a hill and executed without trial, act that one chronicler claimed had loosed a howl upon the land. Suppressed Catholic manuscripts hint at a whispered curse, cast in Latin and blood, that promised the king would watch his kingdom rot from within, and find no peace in body nor spirit. Others turned to Anne Boleyn's legacy. Her enemies, in court, had long accused her of witchcraft. Her charm, her ambition unnatural, they said, even her eyes were seen as cursed, one slightly larger than the other. Before her death, she was said to have written a letter to Henry, now lost, in which she warned, your sins will fester, your soul will not rest. I go to the block with clean hands. Can you say the same? But the most unsettling theory, that the horror came not from without but from within, that it was not spirits or spells that consumed Henry VIII in his final days. It was the weight of his own legacy. A reckoning, long delayed. He had executed wives, burned his own friends, torn England from its spiritual core, replaced the Virgin with his own image. Perhaps, in the silence of those final nights, something ancient, stirred not divine, not demonic, but human, memory, guilt, the collective cry of 100,000 voices rising in judgment. And Henry heard them. He had once believed himself God's vessel on earth. But gods do not rot. Gods do not weep in the dark. Gods do not beg shadows for mercy. Every explanation, every theory, ends in silence. In the place where evidence fails, only unease remains. Perhaps it was illness, perhaps it was penance, or perhaps the truth lies sealed beneath the stones of Windsor, where the king's coffin still rests, swollen and cracked, where, even in death, something may yet wait beside him. Asterisk, the burial was swift, quiet, unceremonious. For a man who had once ruled with thunder in his voice and fire at his fingertips, they sealed Henry's corpse in a light-lined coffin, thick, heavy, bolted tight, not out of honor, not to preserve him, but to contain him. The leg had ruptured, the stomach had bloated, the flesh was already splitting, the scent clung to the air like smoke after a burning. They wrapped him in fine linens, doused in oils, yet still, the rot seeped through. He was taken to St. George's Chapel at Windsor, the place he had chosen for himself in life, as if he believed proximity to kingship would shield him from whatever lay beyond. but the chapel was cold that morning. No light, no music. The air, heavy and damp, as though the stones themselves refused to speak his name. And then there is the legend that as the coffin was carried into the crypt, a crack formed along its base. The lead had softened. The heat of decay. Too much, that black liquid poured from the rupture thick, viscous, and foul. It dripped onto the stones of the chapel floor, soaked into the flagstones. That night, wild dogs broke into the church. They say the priests found them there, licking the stones clean. The official chronicles do not speak of it. They record the burial with grace, with dignity, as if to bury not just the man, but the memory of his final days. Yet witnesses, those not sworn to silence, remember different things. A tremor beneath the earth, a bell that rang once, and then never again. A flickering light behind the stained glass, long after the candles had been snuffed out. And something else, a sound from beneath the crypt, not words, not moans, a low steady hum, like breath. Some priests claimed it was the wind. Others refused to go back inside. For months after, the chapel remained closed to the public. No mass was held, no pilgrims came. Something about the place had changed. The air felt wrong. The tapestries grew mold, no matter how often they were cleaned. Even today, there are rumors among the chapel wardens of footsteps heard when no one is there, of the feeling, late at night, of being watched from beneath the floor. Henry VIII lies buried beside his third wife, Jane Seymour, the one woman he claimed to have loved. But love is a brittle shield. He had torn England in two, dismantled centuries of faith, killed without remorse. And in the end, there was no comfort, no peace, just darkness, and something else. Something that stayed. They say kings leave behind legacies, cathedrals, laws, bloodlines. But what if they leave behind something else? A stain, a whisper, a presence that clings to stone, to memory, to the soul of a place. What if Windsor is not just a tomb, but a cage? What if the king never truly left? Some priests still pray in silence as they pass the crypt, not for Henry's soul, but for whatever still listens below. He was a god once, yes, but even gods must answer. And so we are left with this. Was it madness that consumed him? Disease that devoured him from within? Or was it justice? Did the ghosts come for the king at last? Or did he summon them himself, one sin at a time? And when he closed his eyes, what did he see, waiting in the dark? What answered him?